So now let's investigate web attacks from a forensic standpoint. We're zooming back now. We say, okay, we've got the web server log, the FTP server log, the local systems log, if that's the EVT files, if it's the Windows side, or the sys logs, if it's the Apache side. We'll confirm that web attack. We'll see that there's a failure there, or we've lost information, or we see that we've exposed credit card information. We'll check all that log file information and we'll start correlating it, and that will allow us to identify the nature of the attack. Was it evil attack, malformed input? Were they going after credit card information? What was the intent of the attack? You may want to check and see if it's a denial of service, but you would know that much more so by reviewing your intrusion detection systems or your router logs at that point. Look for localized sources of this. It could be a misconfiguration. I say localized sources that's internal to your organization. That misconfiguration happens all the time, and forensics investigators jump to, it's a denial of service from evil attackers. No, it's not. Some sort of misconfiguration happened on the backside. The other proof that it's external, if you don't see it here locally, is you'll see lots of data inside your intrusion detection log, inside of your firewall log, and also inside of your router logs. Please turn on routing logging if possible. So you're going to look at all that data, and then you say, okay, what am I going to do next? If it's a dynamic event while they're trying to actually access you, then obviously you can figure out where they're coming from. If it's a single source IP address, and you can block that with your intrusion detection systems or with your firewall logs. If it's an ongoing denial of service, you're not going to be able to control that or suggest controls internally for them. What you're going to have to do is go to your upstream internet service provider and see if they'll help you block these attacks. Now, this next piece here, disconnect the compromised system from the network. Here's the problem. Is this running your business? Is this making more money while it's under attack than if you turn it off and it's not? You could be losing $1,000 a minute, but this site is $1 million a minute site. Then you're going to have to say, okay, well, we can't turn this off. If this is virtualized, and that's when it's really good, and we're moving toward virtualization in a lot of cases, or if this is a cloud service provider, get a snapshot of it. So slow down for a moment in time, pull a copy of that, both your VM RAM, because remember it's virtualized RAM, so you can pull a snapshot of that, and the full underlying system. Do your deep investigation as quickly as you possibly can to find the source of the attack, and then protect yourself against it or go after that attacker. And then you're going to, theoretically at that point, you're going to investigate the source of the IP address that's attacking you if it's a single IP address. Again, if it's a denial of service, this is an internet service provider problem that if you haven't prepared for denial of service beforehand, you're not going to be able to protect yourself from it at this moment in time. There are vendors out there that will give you denial of service protection, but you've got to pre-plan for a lot of that stuff. You can't just say, oh, I need help right now, because it's too late. If you're investigating an attack against an IIS server, remember you've got the event viewer locally. You want to correlate both your web log and your event viewer log together and see if there's some sort of tracking that you can do between the two of them that will lead you to the root cause analysis of this attack. If you look for failed login attempts and locked out accounts on this local machine, because it is a web server, it doesn't have an Active Directory database hooked to it. I hope it doesn't. If you're looking here, what you're going to see is you've got an administrator account, and you're going to see lots and lots of failed attempts at getting into that administrative account. If attackers gain control over the web interfaces and now is going after the underlying operating system authentication mechanism, you've got a much deeper problem, and there you're going to see lots and lots of events generated in the event log going after system administrator or whoever the IIS administrators are on that local box. Also, look at the file shares on that box, because it may be that they're outbound giving request. They've turned on server message block, and they've said, okay, well, we want to download files, sharing out the C drive, and then sucking all that information down from the server over HTTP. Look at which users have open sessions. This will eliminate a lot of the inappropriate activity. When we talk about open sessions, go back to what we talked about in the earlier modules that talked about the use of net use, NBTstat, those kinds of commands, all the ones that start with N or I. Those are the kinds of commands you want to look at that will help you gain information about local resources, local attacks versus remote attacks against the machine. Look at which sessions the machine has open on the other systems. It may be that it's connecting to the server back here, and in some denial of service cases, what's happened is the database server itself goes nuts and by accident is attacking the web server on this side, or the query that was sent by a client is chewing up the database server on the back side because it was an inappropriate query that takes a very long time. And then what happens is all the other inbound requests that are coming to the server from everybody else out there, what's happening now is those inbound requests are coming here and they're not being fulfilled by this server on the back end because it's responding to this particular query over here. What that looks like is a slowdown in the server here, and it looks like rejected responses from the web server here, when in reality it's the database server back behind that's causing the problem. That's usually because the query that was allowed to pass through the web server to the database server was too large to fulfill in that particular time period, and then drives the SQL server nuts, which, since the web server is nothing more than a shell and a pass-through, it looks like a denial of service at that point. Look at your NetBIOS over TCP IP connect activity. You probably want to limit that or eliminate that. Look at all the listening ports, the TCP and UDP ports. If an attacker has gained control over this machine and it's actively running, unusual listening ports usually are an indicator of some tool like Netcat, where they've actually are processing commands off of a different channel other than the 80 or 443. I strongly urge any IIS admins that are out there to, on their firewall in front of their web server, block everything except for the 80 and 443 for any outbound request, and then also make sure that any connections that come from inside are valid ports that should be open at that point in time. Don't treat this IIS server like it's a regular client and make connections to the web from it. Do them somewhere else. Those fake connections will show open ports when there really shouldn't be any for that client. Look for unusual tasks in the local host, and remember, all the tools that you're using right now, if this is truly a compromised web server, those tools locally on that machine, if it's compromised by malware and being controlled by somebody else, those executables that you may use, ipconfig, NBTstat, those kinds of things, may be compromised on the local machine, so you may need to run them from a separate drive, from a separate USB drive, to get a real response out of them. Look for new accounts in the administrator group. That's a classic place. They want to take control, so they not only do they attack the web server, but they attack the underlying operating system. If you've got any kind of processes running in the task manager, especially a classic one for testing, by the way, to see whether you've gained control over the machine, is Notepad. So if you've got Notepad running on your web server, that was probably a quick little test. The reason why they use Notepad is because it's quick, it's efficient, it's there, it's easy to type, and then that Notepad keeps on running for a long time after that. It may be another process, but that's one that I always look for. Usually the rookie attackers are doing that. So look in the processes. This means that when we're looking at processes, now we may be doing that on a live system because we're trying to fight an attacker. If they're hacking us, we're trying to go ahead and figure out what they're doing. If you don't want the attacker to suspect what you're doing, maybe you do a quick reboot on that server, and before you do a RAM dump, pull that across so that you can see what processes are running outside of the web server itself. And then when you actually reboot the server, at that point in time, then you start turning on listening devices, lots of intrusion detection mechanisms, lots of Wireshark or TCP dump connections that you're pulling from it. Treat it like a network attack at that point. Check file space usage for sudden decrease in free space. Usually that's a big problem that we run into when the web server has been attacked and is now serving up files for others. Now we want to talk about the checklist, and this is just a couple of little pieces here that are more on the security side of things. Make sure that users don't have weak or missing passwords. Remember, we don't want this web server being a part of our larger authentication domain. If it's Windows, we don't want it to be a part of the Active Directory domain if we can help it. So what will happen is we have an authentication database here. So we want to do password authentication or password strength test against this local SAM here. Block all those unused ports that come from that server. So we do that at the firewall, at the intrusion detection system, and also on the local host here. There's plenty of firewalling mechanisms on all of our web servers, whether it's Windows or Linux. A check for the various web attacks. What I tell IIS administrators to do is to go and learn about the OWASP Top 10 and learn about those protection mechanisms that they can implement on their servers. Check where the IDS, intrusion detection system, or intrusion prevention system is actually deployed for that particular host. Again, capturing packets is a good idea. Last little bit of a checklist here before we're finished up with the web is use vulnerability scanners. Nessus is a great vulnerability scanner, but you must pay for Nessus, so you might want to think about using something like OpenBOSS if you can't afford those robust tools like Nessus. Test the website to check whether it can handle the large loads. There are plenty of stress testing tools out there, especially if it's an e-commerce site. One of the things that happens is some sites become very popular very fast and they can't deal with the load that's coming across. If you know you're doing big marketing promotions for that web server, then from a security standpoint you need to say, can we provide availability to all those people that want to purchase from us? A classic example of this is right around Thanksgiving in the US. What happens is there's a big advertising promotion for Victoria's Secrets when they have the Victoria's Secrets Angels. The Victoria's Secrets website, the first year that they did this, they thought it was robust enough, and they had something like 1 million hits a minute when all those commercials were going on, and the website just went down. Another classic example of this is the first time that AT&T and Apple got together for the iPhone. The registration mechanisms that were used inside of the Apple Store to actually connect up with the AT&T systems to register the phones, they actually went down over and over and over again. The AT&T servers went down because they had never registered this many customers at any one time. How I knew about this attack was after the fact, but I never waited in line before, but I waited in line for the first iPhone, and what you would see is the line would start moving, the servers would go down, and the line would stop. 30 minutes later, the line would start moving, people would be going in and registering, and then it would stop again. And this went on for 8 hours. So those e-commerce sites, they really need to be tested against this, the large self-denial of service, if you will, and that's called stress testing. Document the list of techniques, devices, policies, and necessary steps for security. I strongly urge you to talk to your admins about CI security. There are plenty of hardening guidelines for that, and OWASP when it comes to the web. So that's our web attacks and our web security for forensics investigations.